I don't know how to start a video, but I'm Hootless, and this is Rimworld, which I haven't played in a while, but I'm going to play. And today, I am going to be talking about randomness in video games, and I probably should have prepared notes, but I didn't, because I am a badass like that. So, the first thing that I guess I should, talk about, more or less, is, wait, hold on. Yeah, no, that's fine. So the first thing that I should define is, what is randomness? And I'm sure most of you already know what randomness is, if you're watching this. But for those of you who don't, essentially I would define it as where where the outcome can be different each time based on variables that are outside of the control of, whoever's involved. So in a video game, that would mean the outcome would be different each time, regardless of what the player does. And then, you just have different experiences that way, or different things happen. And that's essentially what the randomness in video games is. So the next thing that I want to talk about is what the difference is between random generation and procedural generation, which is a fairly highly disputed topic, I would say. It's not something that's set in stone, It's pretty disputed over what the definition actually is of procedural versus random. But I'll say the way I define it is randomness is where, it's different every time. And that's it. There's no rules guiding the randomness. There's no real guidelines. It's just it's different every time. Procedural generation, on the other hand, I would say, is where it's random, but in addition to being random, it has guidelines. So it's like let's say you wanted to randomly generate this is why I should have notes. Let's say you wanted to randomly generate a picture, right, of the horizon with sort of grass on the bottom, sort of blue sky up on the top, and clouds here and there, and the sun somewhere over there. With random generating, you could do it, and you could just say, place blue, green, yellow, and white randomly until you get something that more or less looks right. And the majority of the results that you're going to get from that are going to be, nonsense. There'll be blue mixed in with the green, the white will be everywhere, the yellow will be everywhere. And just in general, it won't really make any sense at all. Because that's what random is it just, it's just random. It doesn't make sense. It's different every time. And eventually, if you do enough times, if you run it enough times, and you check every one, then eventually you will get the output that you're trying to get, which is to say, sort of green on the bottom, blue on the top, white in the blue, and then yellow somewhere in the blue, or covered up by yellow or the white or whatever. Eventually, you will get there. Procedural generation, on the other hand, simplifies it a little bit, because you can say, I only want green below this point in the picture, but you can do the green however you want down there. And I only want blue above this point in the picture, and then I only want white to generate in circles next to other circles of white in the blue, and I only want the yellow to show up in one circle, and all of the yellow has to be in a circle, and there can only be one circle. So if you do it the procedural way, you set all those guidelines, it's still random, but it looks right every time. So instead of having to go through and check and see, whether it's correct or not, you can just say everything that this generates will be correct, because I have set the guidelines, and the guidelines will make it correct. It's still random, like I said, but you can sort of cut a lot of the pain out of the process, because you can get the exact results you're trying to get every time. And that's the main benefit of procedural generation over random generation. And we'll take another example, and we'll say, let's say you're trying to generate a random maze, right? With a path through it to get to the end each time. If you just do random generation to place all of the wall tiles and where the floor tiles are and everything, then there's no guarantee that there'll be a path from the beginning to the end because it's random. So, you don't have any way of checking and being like, make a path from the beginning to the end. So again, you have to check every time and do pathfinding or some kind of algorithm to make sure that there's a path that goes from the start to the finish. And as a result, that can take a lot of tries before you get something that is correct. But with procedural generation, what you can do is essentially you could have you could have it choose a path from the beginning to the end so that it knows where the path is already going to be. Make sure that it leaves those spots clear, and then, do like the fractal based or whatever, going off of that, creating different branches and stuff to try and confuse the player, and you make the initial path really long and winding, and then you just fill everything up with randomly placed walls, and you still fit in like some kind of logic to it, like, maybe it has to choose a point, and then it has to pathfind back to the main path, and then if it does that, then it can place walls everywhere around that and have that be a path, and then you do that enough times and you end up with a maze, and you complicate it enough, you have like a relatively difficult maze to get through, and you've randomly generated it, except not really because you've procedurally generated it. And then you have a maze that theoretically would work every time the first time. And that's essentially the benefit, again, of procedural generation over random generation, is that procedural lets you control it to a better degree, and in addition to controlling it to a better degree, you can just do things faster, because you can set it up so that specifically you'll follow certain guidelines, and it'll be random to a point. Not everything would be random, but that kind of defeats the purpose. You don't want everything to be random, because if everything's random, then it doesn't make sense. So, having now defined what randomness is, and the difference between random and procedural generation in games, I will now talk about, different levels of randomness. And I'm not going to differentiate every time between randomly generated and procedurally generated, because I don't really need to. I'll just say randomly generated, and just assume that I mean any method of generating something randomly to an endpoint. So, the lowest level, of course, is no random generation at all. We'll use quests as an example. Like an open world role-playing game, and quests are what you're trying to generate. So you're generating quests. And you're generating the world too, but we'll get to that in a second. So, the lowest level of randomness would be you have placed everything yourself. You've created all the quests. You've crafted the world. You know where everything is. Everything's there for a reason. And that reason is, relatively clear, at least to you. So, everything makes sense, essentially, is the point. And in everything making sense, there's not really any randomness, because you don't need any randomness if you're placing everything yourself. So that's sort of the more traditional way, I would say, of doing things. Or, yeah, more or less, Usually that kind of thing is handcrafted. But more and more recently, it seems like it's becoming a trend to use more procedural generation in games, and this leads to, different terrain environments each time, or different quests that'll show up. And that leads into the next highest level of random generation, which is you randomly generate things, or procedurally generate, or whatever, and after doing so, you check over it. So, like, you don't do it every time, but you randomly generate it for yourself, and then you look it over, you tweak it a little bit so that it makes more sense, and then you use that. So that's kind of like procedural generation, but not really. Why isn't this being made, by the way? I don't think I have enough wood. But anyways, you're still kind of procedurally generating, but you aren't really procedurally generating, because it's not going to be different every time for the players. It's going to be the same every time, but you didn't have to do any work for it. And that's kind of like That's probably another popular method. It's the way I would most likely do it if I didn't want it to be completely random, but also wanted to get out of doing a lot of work. So you have no random generation, and only you see the random generation. That's like the two lowest random ways. The next highest after that would be, like the quests are. Okay, so the next highest would be you have a list of things that it can be, and you randomly select from the list. So, like, you have 30 possible quests, and whenever you need a quest, you just pick a quest off the list, and you hand it to the player, and it's like, go kill 5 of this enemy, or go collect 10 of that item. And you just have 30 of those, and they don't change any of the time, so it's always the same if you happen to get the same entry. And whenever you need a quest, you just pull from that. So that's probably like, it's more random than the previous ones, less random than other possible options. It's not a bad way to do things. Like, as long as you have a fairly substantial list of quests. Why is this bed not getting built? Can you just work on the bed, please? Thank you. So it's not a bad option as long as you have a lot of quests, so it's not very obvious that you're just reusing the same 20 or 30 quests or whatever. Like, you want a lot of quests if you're doing it that way, because otherwise people will be able to tell really quickly, and it'll kind of take away from the effect. It'll be a negative instead of a positive that it's randomly generated if it becomes really obvious that it's randomly generated. So the next one above that would be you have quests that are kind of selected randomly from a list, but also there are random elements inside of it. So for example, instead of having a list of a few hundred quests that are always the same, you have a list of a few different types of quests, like a fetch quest where you have to go get items, or, a kill quest where you have to go kill certain enemies, and then the amount required for it is changed each time, or what you're trying to find is changed each time. So instead of having go collect 5 apples, and go collect 10 limes, and go collect 20 lemons, and those are 3 entries on the quest list, you just have go collect blank of blank. And every time that quest comes up or is given to a player, then it would have a specific number that it generates within a range, perhaps, for the specific items you're doing. And it would select like a random item, maybe have quest reward based on how hard the item is to get or whatnot. But that's unnecessary, but for the purposes of this anyways. So then you have quest givers that can hand out quests, and when they hand out the quests, it's more or less different every time. Like, the players will be able to see the same formulas, but they won't necessarily get the same outputs as often as if you did not do it this way. Like, if you had the specific list of quests that were chosen from, you would get duplicates probably a lot quicker than doing it this random way. Although it is just random chance with this, whether or not players get the same thing twice. And they could. It would be a very low chance, depending on how many things you put in, but it would be possible to get the same thing twice. So that kind of leads into the next layer of randomness, which starts to get into too random, which is a thing. You don't want to have too much randomness in a game, because it stops being a unique experience at that point. Eventually, it's kind of what happened with No Man's Sky, I would say. And there's probably a lot of other games that have done it, but that's just the most recent example. Somebody is sleeping outside. Flynn over there, because nobody wanted to put together this bed. But anyways, No Man's Sky, every planet's different. So as a result of every planet being randomly generated and looking different, eventually they all start to look the same, because they have the same sort of elements and the same general makeup, right? There's not too many different variants, so if you go to enough planets, eventually you start to see the patterns, and then it starts to look all the same, and it stops being interesting, it stops being a unique experience. And that's sort of a very hard thing to stop from happening in a game. Once you start having a lot of random things, eventually it stops being special, because it's really hard to create randomly generated worlds or items or whatever randomly generated anything that has that same unique touch that something created by a person would have, you know. You can tell that it's artificial because it just doesn't feel like it's created by a person. It just feels like it feels bland because there's nothing unique about it. And you could travel to 100 other planets and see roughly the same thing. And instead of if you had 100 planets that are all crafted by hand, and then you go to each of them and they're vastly different, and there's huge differences between all of them. And maybe you could accomplish the same kind of feeling almost with random generation on a small scale. Like when you start to generate, say, 1,000 planets, they start to look more similar than if you generate 6 planets, and they're all different types. So, you know, you have ice planets, jungle planets, ocean planets, um, you know, like a variety planet where there's a bunch of different types. So, like Earth, a desert planet, a lava planet, and those are all really unique from each other. But you'd only really have the uniqueness when there's only one of each. If there starts to be 10 of each, 50 of each, 100 of each, 1,000 of each kind of planet, eventually players start to just stop caring because they all look the same. So why should they care if everything looks the same? And it doesn't really matter which way you go when you're exploring because ultimately you've seen it before. So that's where you start to get into a problem of too much randomness, where you have to strike that balance where there's enough randomness to take the load off of how much work you have to do, but at the same time there's little enough randomness that it still feels like a unique experience. And then of course you can always go crazy and make it literally a different game every time with randomness, where, you know, the world is different every time, and the NPCs are different every time, the items are different every time, the game mechanics are different every time, and you just get into sort of a crazy spot where it doesn't feel I don't know if it would feel unique at that point. I've never seen anybody do randomness to that kind of extreme, but essentially you just have it so that everything is different every time. And if you put in enough options, that would be pretty crazy to see, because it might not be the most interesting every time, like, to play, but it would be really interesting to see a game that is different for everybody who plays it, especially if it's significantly different for everybody who plays it instead of only a tiny bit different. So ultimately, you know, you have to find that balance, like I've been saying, of random enough but not too random. And that's pretty much all there is to it, I guess. Just find that balance and you'll have the perfect amount of randomness, probably. But anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed watching this. Thank you so much for watching. You know, I do these videos, and that's really it. I do them, I guess. I don't really have anything more to say than that, and I'm really bad at ending videos if that's not really obvious. So I'll see you guys next time. Bye.